Hi, I'm Dr. Gwen Irwin, and welcome back to my channel, Healing for Your Life. Today I wanted to do a follow-up video on trauma. In the first video in this playlist, I talked about what trauma is and why it remains and how it remains unresolved. So I had planned to do a follow-up video on that, on the many faces of trauma, which I am going to go into. But I also want to say that, like you, I am very affected by the violence and the shooting and some of the really horrific, tragic events going on in our country. And I'm going to try to use a way of looking at those events that will be helpful for you in terms of dealing with trauma, because these events truly are traumatic, of great magnitude for the people who experience them directly, for first responders, for the media, for those of us who see it vicariously through the media, or as bystanders or survivors. So I'm going to begin today with a concept that was created by a man by the name of Denny Wolfe. It's called the authorial voice. And this authorial voice is a capacity that is inherent within us from the beginning of life, but it has to be developed. It has to be nurtured and encouraged and welcomed. So the authorial voice means I can author my experience. I am no longer just the object in a sentence. I'm the main subject in the sentence. I go from being a me and a little 2-year-old who says, "Me want cookie," to an I want a cookie. Or I want to go outside and play in the rain. Now, we may not be able to do that, but we certainly can speak it, and hopefully we'll have a parent who say, "Isn't it fun to play in the rain?" Well, it's not lightning and thundering, so let's get our boots on and our umbrella and let's go out and play. That authorial voice means that the child's opinions, needs, and desires are not only allowed to be expressed, but are welcomed in being expressed. So a parent can say to a 3-year-old, "Would you like a spoon or a fork? Would you like some apple or would you like some grapes?" Now, the child may express needs and desires that they really are not old enough or would be safe enough to have. But again, we're hoping that parents can offer a really good alternative that will still be satisfying. This authorial self is critical to see in a 3-year-old. That doesn't mean if it isn't there, the child won't ever get it. But in healthy development, we want to see that authorial voice showing up. Now, when it comes to trauma, this is a very important concept, because Frank Putnam, who is this expert on states that I referred to in the video on states, shows us that by the age of 3, we have a pretty complex state system, which we call personality. Prior to the age of 3, one of the largest impacts of trauma on a young child is that it prevents or impedes the formation and the coherence of that personality from even forming partially or completely. And so you won't see authorial voice in a young child under the age of 3 who has had trauma in their lives, because they have not had the support and the nurturance that they need for authorial voice to really develop. After the age of 3, trauma affects a person differently. It disturbs one's sense of personality. It can even shatter one's personality and fundamentally change that individual. But the personality, the foundation of it, has been established. We're going to come back to this concept again when we talk about voice and language and development, because when a personality doesn't form, it affects one's personal voice and even the language they use. And after the age of 3, if their personality has been negatively impacted or severely disturbed, that too is going to affect their voice and language along with many other elements. All right, so trauma is processed differently depending on a person's age and their phase of life and how far along they are on the developmental trajectory. So a child with a good enough beginning and really solid foundation in the first 5 years of life is going to be able to cope with trauma in, I don't want to say an easier way, but in a less damaged way than a child who has not had that kind of foundation. And similarly, an adult who goes through trauma is going to be able to cope with trauma differently and better if they had a good enough foundation, rather than having to build an early traumatic experience. So let's look at some of the phases of trauma and some of the elements within it. To some degree and in some kind, every trauma, without exception, involves loss. Now, it may be the loss of a person to accident, illness, or death. It may be the loss of a place and a sense of home or belonging. It may be the loss of an object or an experience. It may be the loss of innocence or trust. It may be the loss of trust in a person we had thought we could trust. And it may be a loss in our sense of self. But there is loss in every traumatic experience. That is what makes it traumatic. And the idea that we have natural loss in life, a goldfish dies, a pet dies, a family member dies at some point, never really feels natural. That's a myth. That's one of the myths of trauma and loss, because we feel the loss. It doesn't feel natural. It feels against the very natural energy of life that we carry. So it never feels good and it never feels right. And you'll have somebody say about somebody in their 90s, well, they had a good life, and so the loss is okay. Not so. The loss will never feel okay, even if there's relief in it because the person is no longer suffering. The loss of having that person in our lives is very real. The other myth about trauma and loss is what's called closure. Now, there may be clinicians or people who don't agree with me, but in my opinion, both personally and professionally, there is no such thing as closure. That's like closing a door and the thing doesn't exist anymore. It's out of sight, out of mind, or it's all kind of settled. The problem is that loss and trauma really don't ever get undone. They're experiences that happen and that have happened. It's like having a broken leg that is healed or mended versus a leg that was never broken. They're two different kinds of legs. So with loss and trauma, you can have adaptation, which is what we hope for. We can have change, which is inevitable because we are affected by the loss and affected by the trauma. And we can have adjustment that isn't really adaptation. We just sort of resign ourselves to the effects of the loss, rather than using it in an adaptive way for meaning, for purpose, for growth, for doing something with it that is creative or productive or edifying or transformative. Trauma is made up in the loss of three basic types, three basic phases. Deprivation is one, neglect is another, and abuse is another. We're going to delve more deeply into each of these in subsequent videos. But for today, let's tease out the difference. Deprivation is being deprived of and having to live without basic needs. Now, a child might feel deprived if they don't have wants, but it's the needs where deprivation really shows up. The need for comfort, the need for reliable shelter, the need for protection, the need for safety, the need for sustenance. All of these are fundamental needs. The need to be creative and explore, the need for variety, the need for invention, the need for relationships, the need for love and caregiving and caretaking. Neglect is being shunned, ignored, put off, considered not important, and left to young devices that can't meet the needs. And abuse, whether it is physical, sexual, financial, mental, emotional, all occur because a relationship is actively harmful. All of the consequences of trauma continue to live, but they don't have to eventually contaminate our lives. As I said in the previous video on trauma, there are ways to resolve trauma, and in so doing, to learn to adapt to the effects of it in creative and life-giving ways rather than life-taking ways. Now, two other things we're going to talk about as we go along is post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress. I'll be delving into those more thoroughly in their own videos, but for today, I just want to say that post-traumatic stress is usually, not exclusively, but usually event-based. And it may be time-limited in terms of having a beginning and a middle and an end of the event, but the consequences don't end. And that's where PTSD comes in. So when an individual is triggered, the past is flash-forwarded into current experience. And the person feels very much as they did, again, this is all state-dependent, the way they did in the original traumatic experience. Most people call them flashbacks. The person doesn't really go backwards in time. The trauma of the past comes forward in time and changes their current time experience. Complex PTSD is much more relationally based. It's the day in and day out abuse or neglect or deprivation that takes place relationally that affects a person. Now, many of the effects may be the same as in PTSD in terms of physical sensations. These are all state-based. In terms of belief systems, perceptual bias, attachment systems, memories, voice and language, behavior. The added element in CPTSD is that it affects one's sense of self. And in that, it affects the person's sense of being helpless and hopeless to change the relational experience. Now let's take what we've talked about today and look at the trauma that as a society we are now facing. I mean these as psychological statements and viewpoints, so I hope that they'll be taken in that spirit. We have mass shootings occurring. We have multiple shootings occurring, as in Chicago over the weekend, in addition to the Garlic Festival in Gilroy and the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, Ohio. We also have ongoing relational trauma occurring on our borders for young children as well as parents and adults. Trauma is not only about children. That doesn't minimize their experience in any way. And they will have to process it like a spiral staircase for years to come, because it will reoccur and reoccur in terms of its effects to a greater or lesser degree, even as it's resolved, because it can be triggered. It did happen. And we need to honor that it happened. Not honor what happened, but honor that it happened. So the children and the parents who are in cages in our border came here because they had a perceptual bias that this country would shelter them and be a safe place to be. That perceptual bias has been ripped away from them, and they now are in a traumatic experience that to them has possibly no end. Certainly the consequences of their experience will have no end. They will be changed and affected by this experience for the rest of their lives. They may eventually, when they're in a safe haven, recover. They may eventually, with help and processing and care and love, be able to adapt to a new way of life, but they are changed forever. Not only have the victims of these shootings lost their lives, but their loved ones are changed forever. Bystanders are changed forever by what they have witnessed. Vicariously, those of us who have seen the reports and seen the events have been changed. We take notice of our surroundings when we go to a local store. We take notice of our surroundings when we go to a public event. We look for where the exits are. We take pictures of our group before we go, so that in a moment, if we needed to, and we couldn't remember, we'd know what they were wearing. We'd be able to identify those we were with and perhaps find them more easily. We live in a society now of warfare, but it is warfare that is psychologically based as well. Annette Oltmans is the founder of what's called the M310 Project. It is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to helping people recover from abuse, both the victims and the abusers. One of the concepts that she named and coined the phrase of was double abuse. And what that stands for is that when somebody is traumatized and an abuse victim of some kind reaches out for help, those to whom they reach out to, whether it is a friend, a family member, an organization, an institution of some kind, college, workplace, a church, synagogue, whatever, does not respond to their need, and in so doing betrays them even further and exacerbates and duplicates the original abuse. We see this happening societally every day, whether it is a sex scandal, whether it is the children at the borders, whether it is a child being molested, whether it is a caregiver, a son or daughter in adulthood caring for a dying parent, for somebody who has experienced multiple losses. Maybe they've had to change jobs and change cities. Maybe a better opportunity, it is still a loss in terms of what's familiar. We have thousands of examples of trauma and thousands, millions of faces of trauma. My quest as a service provider and an expert in treating trauma and understanding development is to help people learn how to recover and eventually adapt in life-giving ways. Join me on this quest, and thank you.